Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the state of Minnesota and whether or not Republicans have a realistic chance of flipping this state this November. So we're going to take a look at the 2022 governor's race in particular, as well as the AG's race. Then we'll take a look at recent Minnesota elections, as well as Minnesota's politics overall, to kind of get a sense as to whether or not it makes sense for Republicans to potentially be able to pick off a statewide race or two in the state of Minnesota. So we'll take a look at all of that in just a second, but first, please consider subscribing down below if you're new and liking this video down below if you enjoy. So the reason I decided to dedicate a full video just to the state of Minnesota is because its politics is pretty unique. You know, unlike the rest of the Midwest that trended to the right in the election of Donald Trump back in 2016, Minnesota still stayed blue. I mean, the result was narrow, but that's mostly because Hillary Clinton underperformed the margins of previous Democratic nominees like Barack Obama, John Kerry, and Al Gore. So it's really not so much that the state of Minnesota trended to the right, it's more so that it fell away from the Democrats back in 2016. Now, the rural areas did trend pretty dramatically to the right, but Donald Trump's overall vote share was smaller than that of Mitt Romney's back in 2012, who I think got just about 45% of the vote in 2012. So it was about the same, a little bit less, but Hillary Clinton massively underperformed Barack Obama, who got about 52% of the vote in this state back in 2012. And, you know, despite all of these rural areas all across Minnesota trending, in some cases, 20 points to the right, the Minneapolis metro area, the Twin City area, trended to the left and as a result kept the state blue in 2016. And in 2020, the state trended dramatically more to the left from where it was in 2016. It went from voting for Hillary Clinton by just 1.5 percentage points to voting for Joe Biden by over 7. And that was mainly because you saw dramatic shifts again in the Twin City metro area. Had the Twin City area voted the same as it did in 2012, this state would have been a lot closer. And in 2016, it would have actually flipped for the Republican Party. So this has really been a tricky state for the Republicans because while the rural areas are trending more to the right overall, they're less and less of the population every year. The Minneapolis area is growing at a pretty rapid rate, and a lot of these rural counties are losing population and they're being outvoted by not just Hennepin County and Ramsey County, but these suburban counties as well, in which Republicans have sort of fallen off in recent years to where they were previously. Now, looking at the 2022 governor's race in particular, Tim Walz isn't exactly in the strongest position as of right now. He's only polling ahead by 3.5%, but it is early. Early polling tends to not be as accurate. And also, both candidates are polling pretty low. Tim Walz only has 43% of the vote in the average, and Scott Jensen has 39% of the vote. Now, I expect both candidates to increase their vote shares as we get more accurate polling, but Tim Walz is still ahead nonetheless. And there are a lot of third-party candidates that could potentially take from both parties, but I think they might end up hurting Tim Walz a bit more than the Republican. But nonetheless, Jensen is still polling at around 39-40%. Tim Walz is polling anywhere from the high 40s to the low 40s. So he is polling ahead as of right now, but it is still early. But the generic ballot in 2022 is expected to be at least R+2. That's the FiveThirtyEight polling average so far. And they actually predicted R+6. So in a state that voted for Joe Biden by just 7 percentage points in a D+5 environment, how would a state like Minnesota vote in an R+6 environment? Now, Minnesota, again, as I said, does have pretty strange politics because despite red waves in both 2010 and 2014, Minnesota elected and then re-elected Democratic governors as well as other statewide officials. And if we take a look at the political party breakdown of Minnesota, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is essentially the Democratic Party just in Minnesota, has dominated statewide politics since the 1950s, so basically since the mid-20th century, and it really only went red on the presidential level since the mid-20th century, and that was in 1972 during Nixon's 49-state landslide. The only state to go blue in that election was the state of Massachusetts. So Minnesota as a whole has a strong history of electing liberal Democrats to office. Obviously, Eugene McCarthy, Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, all sort of Democratic icons of the late 20th century, and they're all from Minnesota. So it does have a strong political history and labor history within the state. You know, Minnesota is a very unionized state, a lot of mining, a lot of union jobs all across the state, and you know, Trump's overperformance with union voters in 2016 is one of the reasons why you saw such massive swings in these rural areas, you know, coupled with the fact that rural areas have been trending away from the Democratic Party really for some time now. But, you know, ultimately these rural shifts aren't enough to counteract the Twin City area and the northeastern part of the state, but really just the Twin City area, because these areas aren't exactly the most populated. But if we take a look back at 2018, the last time incumbent Governor Tim Walz won his election, he won by about 11 points, you know, and this was right after the state had only gone to Hillary Clinton by 1.5. And again, that's mainly because of the third party vote share. But Tim Walz was able to overperform in the Minneapolis suburbs. You know, this was also on the back of the blue wave, which saw a lot of Democrats sweep into power around the country in 2018. But, you know, the Minneapolis area continued to trend more in favor of the Democrats. If we actually look at the other statewide races, Amy Klobuchar winning her Senate re-election by a total landslide. She's a very popular you know, sort of centrist, standard run-of-the-mill Democrat from the state of Minnesota, and, you know, still popular in some of these rural areas. And that's one thing I want to note about the Minnesota Democrats right off the bat, is that they still have appeal in some of the rural parts of the state. Tim Walz was able to win and narrow up a lot of these rural counties, which in other states like Pennsylvania, Michigan would be safe red, even in a blue wave year, as we saw in a lot of those counties. So, you know, Minnesota in general is much more liberal than its counterparts in the Rust Belt or the rest of the Midwest. And that's something we have to factor in when looking at 2022. Now, the Republican nominee for governor, Scott Jensen, does have sort of a mixed record. I don't know exactly the sort of campaign he's running. I know previously he'd actually supported some gun control measures during his tenure in the legislature. So I don't know. I don't think he stands by that anymore, but he does have some more moderate positions in his past. And, you know, the Minnesota Republican Party did have a convention style system similar to Virginia to make sure that he was able to get the nomination. You know, we'll see how well he's actually able to do across the entire state, but certainly I think he'll do better with suburban women and other demographics like that. But Tim Walz is still a popular incumbent governor, and Minnesota is more liberal than other states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So I think it's one of the states where the abortion issue and other social issues might have more of an outsized impact than they will in those Rust Belt states come the 2022 election. Also, the Minnesota GOP doesn't exactly have a good track record of winning elections in Minnesota. The last time Minnesota went red on the gubernatorial level was in 2006, and that was the re-election of Tim Pawlenty. And that was only because of vote splitting on the part of the Democrats. When Republicans win elections in Minnesota, it's not usually because they like the Republican, but because they dislike the Democrat more. There was a lot of vote splitting in this election. Tim Pawlenty only won by 1 point. And he was unable to get 50% of the vote. And if we go back to 2002 when he won last time, there was even more of a vote split. And once again, only got 44% of the vote. So Republicans really haven't been able to get over 50% of the vote in Minnesota in the 21st century. We can go back to 2002, the last time a Republican won a Senate seat in the state of Minnesota. The same deal, 49.5% of the vote to former Vice President Walter Mondale, who got 47.3%. Now, he was kind of switched at the last moment because the incumbent Democratic senator actually died in a plane crash shortly before the election, Paul Wellstone. So they kind of threw Walter Mondale in as a sort of surrogate. But nonetheless, you know, versing this sort of candidate at the last minute, this was only a narrow victory for the Republicans in Minnesota. So going ahead at 2022 and looking at the polling, obviously Tim Walz only being ahead by 3.5 is a good sign for the Republicans, but he is still a pretty popular governor in a state that is historically blue and has bucked national trends before. You know, back in 2010 and 2014, the House popular vote did get sort of close, but Democrats still did a lot better in statewide races. Now, the one area where I think Republicans may potentially see a flip is the Attorney General seat. Now, back in 2018, while Amy Klobuchar was getting 60% of the vote, and Tina Smith was getting 53%, and Tim Walz was getting 53%, Keith Ellison only got 49.1% of the vote against some generic Republican who got 45.2%. This is the one race where I think Democrats could potentially lose in 2022. Now, obviously, they can lose the governorship as well, but I think Tim Walz is the favorite, and I've had this race as lean Democrat for a while, and I don't see that changing anytime soon unless the polling or data on the ground changes in Minnesota. But looking at this election in particular, Keith Ellison lost a lot of support in the suburbs of Minneapolis, where Tim Walz was doing particularly well. Dakota County, for instance, Keith Ellison only won by about 3 points. If we scroll up to Tim Walz was able to win this county by 11. So in some ways, there is still split ticket voting in Minnesota, and this could be an area where Republicans, if they're running the right candidate, I'm not really sure who the Attorney General candidate is for the Republicans, but if they run the right candidate, they could potentially see a flip in this seat. Keith Ellison isn't exactly the most popular. Crime has been a big issue in the state of Minnesota. And, back in 2018, he only won by, less than 4 percentage points during a blue wave year, while other statewide Democrats were doing exceptionally well. So it could potentially be a flip for the Republicans, but I still think overall Democrats have the advantage even in 2022, because while the generic ballot may be +6 for the Republicans or +4 or something like that, it's not uniform across all states. There are plenty of examples where states, even during blue waves, elected Democrats. Pennsylvania was one of those in 2014, electing Tom Wolf over an incumbent Republican, Tom Corbett. So I think in the state of Minnesota, you'll see something similar. Now in 2020, when we saw the rioting back in Minnesota as a result of the death of George Floyd, there really wasn't a shift in favor of the Republicans, despite them running campaigns on law and order after Minneapolis had been devastated by an entire summer of rioting. In fact, Minnesota voters doubled down on their support of the Democratic Party by handing Joe Biden a much larger majority than Hillary Clinton's mere plurality just 4 years earlier. And especially in the Twin City area, Joe Biden got 70% of the vote in Hennepin County. That's the highest percentage for a Democrat in a long time in a presidential election. So looking back at even 2012, for example, Obama only got 62.5% of the vote in Hennepin County and 63.4% back in 2008. This is a county that has moved much more to the left and has a sizable chunk of Minnesota's population. And, just because this area was able to swing to the left so massively, it took the rest of the state with it. And I think ultimately, these suburbs around Minnesota, which are much more liberal than suburbs around the rest of the country, historically speaking anyway, I think these are going to provide an anchor for the Democrats in 2022. So while I think Tim Walz is in for a pretty close race in Minnesota, as of right now, I still expect him to win by a lean margin. I could see potentially the Attorney General's race flipping, but I don't think Tim Walz, who's still a pretty popular governor and won by a sizable margin back in 2018, I don't think he's as vulnerable as Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan or, any other Democrat running in the Rust Belt, or even Michelle Lujan Grisham, who I think is much more vulnerable because she's unpopular and because New Mexico is known to swing a lot more during wave years like we saw in 2010 and 2014. New Mexico is still a likely blue state on the presidential level and in federal races, but in off-year midterms that favor Republicans, Republicans have a decent chance and have a history of winning those elections, whereas in Minnesota, they just don't. Republicans didn't win in Minnesota in 2010, in 2014, and I don't think 2022 is going to be the start of that. The suburbs of Minnesota have doubled down on their support for Democratic policy, and I don't think that's going to change even in a wave year. Republicans, I think, will do better in these suburbs than they have in the past, like in 2018 and 2020, but I don't think it's going to be enough to swing the entire state to a Republican flip. And it will be a very interesting map, seeing a Republican governor once again winning in the state of Minnesota, but states like New Mexico flipping red, and even potentially Oregon flipping red, which both of these states voted to the left of Minnesota in the 2020 election. So it will be very interesting to say the least. So my ultimate verdict is I don't think Republicans have the edge in Minnesota despite all of the factors of 2022. Minnesota Democrats have done a good job in the past of distancing themselves from unpopular incumbents like Barack Obama in 2010 and 2014, and I think they'll do the same with Joe Biden. It's just a liberal state historically, and the suburbs are trending away from the Republicans faster than they can gain in the rural areas, and the suburbs are just too big for Republicans to overcome with rural support overall. Leave your thoughts down below. Comment down below what you think. As always, again, thank you all for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.